Hello, I welcome you to Boom Boom VVV. This actually is a pre-launch of a platform which will be officially launched. I believe we're scheduled for the day after Thanksgiving. So this is a pre-launch which was to some extent brought on by I'm going to say the urgency of the moment. There are a number of things that are happening today that I was compelled to speak on to add my understanding, my thoughts, my reflections. And please understand that, my reflections come from understandings seared in the belly of the beast. And so think of this as a initial public service announcement to share with you what are some warnings, some alerts as to what we're confronting. As you know, we're confronting many things on many dimensions, on many levels, and but this particular one has struck a feverish sort of a chord within me, and I could no longer rest until I spoke out about it. So, my thoughts, my ideas, they come with no artificial intelligence. These are real, seared in the belly of the beast. My understandings. I do add a I do add a spice of consciousness along with I want to say a dose, along with the dose, if you will, flavor, along with the flavor of joy, an ounce of thankfulness. Yes, an ounce of thankfulness and a pound of gratefulness to have this moment to share with you. So, with that being said, without any further ado, let me begin. I have my little setup here, all good. I do add a spice of consciousness. Yes, I do. Along with a dose, if you will, flavor. Productions have their props, I guess. So here's mine. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off. That was fun. Oh, so the urgency of the moment, the mania, if you will, that I referred to in my initial introduction there, has to do with our financial markets, the the greed, the folly of today, and I think we've reached a point where we need to address it as aggressively as we're attempting to address many other matters. To some extent, they're one and the same. If nothing else, I hope that and I hope that my historical perspective, analytical perspective, provides you with some enlightenment as to what we what we're up against or where we are in the cosmos, if you will, of things. But also, I treat it with an understanding or from a perspective of how we're intertwined with laws, with principles of nature. The physics of the cosmos are upon us and will, I believe, rule the day. And so, with that, let me proceed. Now, we've been here before. We've had manias before in the financial markets. In fact, we have a whole history of them. Um, but much like a rocket ship taking off, um, there's a great deal of correlation, similarities with how markets perform and operate in bubbles. It is to that to which I speak today and hope to share with you. Just as we launch rockets to outer space, to the moon, we launch markets. And every time we think that this time is different, that this time we will escape, not be bounded by the limitations of physics, that gravity, that old constant of consequence no longer applies. But the question today is simple. Are we flying to new worlds? Some have Mars on the horizon. But here on Earth, are we inflating the same old bubble with shinier fuel, uranium? Huh. Imagine that. After all these years, we now want to bring back uranium as our source of fuel, of energy, despite having discovered or put in place little, if anything, to manage its waste, its explosiveness, in ways that will ultimately be truly beneficial for us. Now, I'm not knocking uranium. I do believe that there is a place for nuclear. I do. However, I do also see that we're rushing forward without a plan, without guides, without prudence. But as we'll see, as I will discuss, there's a lack of prudence in many, many areas today. So join me as we delve deeper into the topic du jour, bubbles. Every mania or bubble has its rhythm, much like every song has its dance. There's displacement. Boom. Yeah, boom. Who better to discuss booms with than Boom Boom? After boom, there's euphoria, profit taking, but ultimately, inevitably, a collapse. The tulip bulb of the 1630s valued little tulip bulbs, those same ones you buy at your local garden, florist, Home Depot. Those same ones were valued as if they were mansions. They were valued that highly, hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's dollars term. The South Sea bubble of I believe it was the 1720s or so, was similar in the crazed ways of man, the greed, the hunger for more and more. The South Sea bubble was so persuasive, it seduced the elites. Sir Isaac Newton himself, perhaps the greatest mind in human history, was caught in its pull and peril. The laws of motion could not resist the motion of the crowd. Newton doubled, then tripled his money early, and watched his prices soared. He got out, but then re-entered. He lost nearly all his gains. His remarks afterwards were, "I can calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." And there it is, the confessions of a genius. Even a man who understood gravity, inertia, force, couldn't escape the psychology of crowds. The invisible forces of belief, envy, greed, that move markets faster than any equation or models. Newton's first law, which, as we'll see, applies today to the ways of men and women in crowds and herds. His first law: an object in motion stays in motion, unless acted upon by an external force. Sound familiar? So too with bubbles. Momentum feeds upon itself as long as belief persists. Prices rise, undaunted, fearless, reaching until a force out of the blue comes against it. In popular literature today, we often refer to some of these forces as black swans, but and perhaps one may come something unknown, something out of the blue, if you will. But it doesn't have to be. You see, we have many, many white swans lingering, very visible, warning us of the perils of our ways. Few events confirm Newton's first law more than manias. Yes, in case you haven't noticed, I do interchange mania with bubbles, I should say. You see, every mania births its own collapse. But it's only seen in retrospect. During its stage of euphoria and boom, nothing seems to threaten it. Nothing seems to bring men to reason. So too with bubbles. Momentum feeds upon itself as long as belief persists, waiting for the faint of heart to lead the herd of believers into gallows of ruin. How ironic. Every parabolic ascent invites an equal and opposite fall. Look at the shape, the curvature, how a rocket takes off. It's fascinating. Also, it's fascinating how it was discovered that this was the curvature that one should take. This was the most speedy ascent, if you will, into the galaxies beyond. But that curvature, turned around, if you will, is much like the parabolic of a bubble. Very similar in shape, very similar in character, and very similar in the ultimate surrender to the forces of nature. But as we'll see in a moment, not all things are. While there are many, many stocks, shiny objects, if you will, there's another side of this coin. While many stocks have gone parabolic, many have done nothing. In fact, I dare say if you were to think of a company, a stock outside of the AI arena, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that's up on the year, up over 3 years. They have no momentum. Call it the Buffett bucket, if you will. Who, by the way, has been warning the markets for, well, over a year now. It needs to check itself. But this Buffett bucket, as I'll refer to it, labors in the dustpan of no pulse, like a patient having a cardiac arrest. At some point, they might, too, and take off, going ballistic, parabolic, with the slow ascent followed by a rapid acceleration. Then once the fuel exhausts, a long, burning fall back to Earth. It is not just mathematics. That's nature reminding us nothing defies gravity forever. Today's mania wears a digital crown, an AI crown, where valuations stretch towards the stratosphere. The Shiller-Cape ratio, a commonly used measure of valuations. There are many others, but it's common, it's accepted as one of the more credible ones. Just as credible as all your neighbors talking about stocks, and or you getting together with your family and friends planning a trip to the local food pantry. Though one may seem more dismaying than the other, they both tell the same story. Well, back to the Shiller-Cape ratio. Today it stands, I believe, at about 40. Its all-time average, or its long-term average, I should say, is about 17. Statistically speaking, this is about in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 standard deviations from the norm. As you know, many other aspects, our circumstances in our reality today are beyond, if you will, our norms, our standards. In fact, I submit to you, one of the more challenging developments of today's times, is the fact that what we're witnessing, what we're going through, is a denormalization. It's an extension of the norms from that traditional bell shape, call it the years of the 50s and or the 60s. I call it the Leave It to Beaver years, to events and occurrences way beyond our imaginations of for our realities. And so today's reality, if you will, lies on extremes. And that's why there's so much, I believe, polarization, a flattening of the curve. It's a difficult process. Some call it progress. I certainly would and do. But others are resistant to change of any kind, of any challenge of norm, their norm usually, and intolerance of any change. Again, that's why I believe we've become so polarized. Yes. But today, many things are operating in the red zone. It's difficult for any system to project, manage events outside 3 standard deviations. In science, in planning a trip to the moon, for example, the way that's dealt with is redundancy, to build in more and more systems that will come into play if the operating system is stretched beyond its limits. The redundancy will catch it and manage it, keep it within norms or processes that can be managed. Today, we have single companies, a number of them, here in the States. The Mac 7. I recently heard some coining of a 10 or something. I forget the exact term. It was the first time I heard it, I think, was yesterday, but now they want to talk 10, and soon I guess they'll be talking many, many more. But the Mac 7, let's see. Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon, Netflix. Who am I forgetting? Tesla. Tesla, how could we forget Tesla? Mm-hmm. They trade outside valuations, outside the bounds of many fiduciary institutions' notion of what's prudent, what's acceptable. These are parameters which have been tried and tested for years. And yet, today, so many lie beyond those parameters. We have companies worth more than nations. Single companies. And it's not just within our boundaries, our borders. It's a global phenomenon. Take Taiwan Semiconductor, for example. Very wealthy company. Perhaps I would argue the most noteworthy player company in the whole today arena of artificial intelligence. It makes most of the semiconductors for NVIDIA, for Apple, for the world. A Taiwanese company. There lies a potential threat. As we know, Xi has plans for Taiwan. But anyway, back to Taiwan. Today, Taiwan, single symbol, single ticker. It represents, I believe, 39% of its nation's index. One company. It's pretty outrageous. Back to the Mag 7, I believe, they represent, in the same neighborhood, an area of 35-ish% of the entire S&P index. These levels we've never seen before. Surpassing the GDP of industrial nations. The global nature, I believe, the global mania, provides a hint, if not the compelling evidence of the cause, the culprit. One needs only to be a little curious and answer the simple question, what do all these nations have in common? Stay tuned, I'll get to it. For now, let's, again, do a little bit more study about valuations. It is said that valuations can extend indefinitely, untethered by any production or profit. One market axiom says that they can last longer than you can withstand with any bearish inclination, despite the overwhelming evidence that current profits are illusionary. Why do I say illusionary? You see, they're sculpted through adjusted earnings, fictitious, non-GAAP creativity. We rarely even apply any GAAP rules today, GAAP principles today. In fact, I have long thought that the most creative discipline, profession, is, believe it or not, accounting. How ironic. More so than the arts, more so than the social sciences, accounting. These guys are the most creative, and these guys and gals are the most creative in our operating systems today. Pro forma imaginations of earnings. Earnings that exist only on slides, not on ledgers. Meanwhile, governments around the world have pledged trillions in commitments. Climate transition, entitlement subsidies, defense. Each promise a brick in the wall of collective delusion. Now, I'm not saying that any of these aren't worthy sort of expenditures that society should make. But as we are beginning to understand and as we're seeing, when one studies if one were to study today economics 101, one of the first questions that's posed rhetorically is within the choices of economics, the decision making of economics and policy, there's one guiding sort of challenge: guns or butter. How debt burdened are we today? That ultimately becomes one of the questions we have to confront. Debt ratios today are at levels that just a couple of decades ago were unfathomable, beyond any sort of classical or traditional, economically justifiable, even manageable understanding of how an economy can survive burdened with so much debt, with such levels that the system would, at such levels, the system simply cannot survive. While today we're two times what, again, a few years back, were tragic. So tragic that if a nation were to reach such levels, if any nation had debt levels we currently have, they would be regarded as third world today. I know of no nation state anywhere in the world today which would not be relegated, regarded as such. Third world. That's not a reggae group. That's a plague. You see, that is little more than stealing from one's future. Well, assuming that at some point you will pay, you can be like many and just say, to hell with it, I ain't paying. Will we come to a point like that? Seems somewhat inevitable. And I'm not the only one who will tell you that. There are many who are concerned about the level of our debt. Parenthetically, as you assess what's going on today, one of the warning signs is clear, but you may not know how to evaluate it, so I'll share it with you. It's a very important configuration, if you will, amongst powers in the market. It's the yield curve. It's the relationship between short-term yields and longer-term yields. And let me just say for now that for as long as you see the yield curve rising, that is longer-term debt becoming more expensive relative to shorter-term debt, it's a warning sign. It's an alert. It may just be a yellow flag. It's still warning. So, what are our options? Well, as I said, we can choose not to pay. But the path that's most often pursued in this circumstance, that most policymakers favor, moreover, the path that's been chosen since the beginning of civilization. What path, you ask? I am referring to devaluation of your currency. How, you ask? You simply print money. Ever heard of this saying, how does it go? Can I buy a hamburger today for $1 tomorrow? Think about it. It's a very similar proposition. We can just say to hell with it. There's nothing I can do. What are you going to do? War comes into play. How? Why? Well, in this circumstance, war, if nothing else, to solve the plethora of problems facing society today, becomes a very persuasive alternative. We're close to those sorts of points, those sorts of only recourse, only choice. Just this past week, there was somewhat of a scare in the markets. Company found a fraud in its balance sheet during its reporting season of about $60 million. The system is so fragile of debt, generally speaking, that this little sneeze, if you will, from a company caused alarm, resulted in a mild panic in capitals, that's with OL, throughout the world. We'll see how this matter gets resolved. But it is true that the beginning of every crisis seems to have been a financial, or had financial roots. bankruptcies, frauds, that sort of thing, often is the ignition to a change of course. Again, we reach the point where energy, the fuel, all of a sudden is gone, lost, exhausted. So many are wondering, how does a little small company, like I said, it's symptomatic of what might be ahead. What might that be? Sovereign defaults. Nations failing to pay one another. Argentina has been in this circumstance for decades now, but once again finds itself unable to pay its debts. America rushes to its aid. Why do you think they do? America wants something else on the table. I believe, my speculation, admittedly. They want those minerals. In fact, things are so fragile and on the edge today that we're having conversations, real conversations, about taking over Greenland. Why? We want their goddamn minerals. That's all. And that's why, by the way, I believe in this upcoming summit between Trump and Xi. I believe Xi holds the upper hand. We'll see how it plays out. But just understand this. This whole issue with what's now being referred to as rare minerals that China's in control of, you cannot make a car, refrigerator, certainly not a little tiny chip, without these minerals. And so the world's been caught off guard, if you will. And so that's the reason why I believe Xi will have the upper hand, and he knows it. Additionally, I would further add that here in the United States, he knows that Donaldson, as he would say, Donald that is, doesn't have a good hand to play here. He's got protests, the biggest the nation's ever seen. Yeah. Xi's got over, how many people does China have today? Well, they have a lot. Billions. And he's got to keep them somewhat comforted, at least on the surface. But in America, that comfort zone seems to be wearing thin today. So we'll see. But also, just let me add, they, that is Xi and the Chinese regime, they approach things strategically, with thought, with design. They know the chessboard. I'm not so sure that we know that there's a board. Moreover, I'm not so sure that all Xi has to say or put on the table is a hotel in Shanghai. Donald just may be satisfied. He needs victory here. We'll see how it plays out. But those who have mentioned the risk of sovereign default have done so all my lifetime, quite honestly. One day they'll be right, but it's been a long time that they've been wrong. So we'll see. I do agree that there is an inevitability to it all. And there is a day to pay up. But is this that day? Or is it still over the blue sky, horizon, still further, as it has been before? Warren Buffett once said, "You find out who's been swimming naked when the tide goes out." Very graphic. Oh, by the way, as you can see, I'm still in putting my platform together. I'm still in the early stages, and um, although I do have my signage, and I'm very proud of that. But I'm still working on a number of things. One of my biggest problems, quite frankly, is remembering passwords. But moving on. But today, I doubt that we'll need the tide to go out. As we're already seeing, all we'll need is a little ripple. And this market can be shaken to its very foundations. If a little company can lose $60 million on a loan and lose $1 billion in its capitalization, it's not rational repricing. It's emotional contagion. It's leverage. You see, fear moves faster than fundamentals. Risk has become reflective, no longer measured in balance sheets, but in tweets, headlines, and sentiment feeds. We call this efficiency, but it's really electricity. Nervous, unstable, reactive. And remember this. This isn't just America's trouble, circumstance. It's humanity's. Back to China. Once the engine of global production, now faces a crisis of direction. It needs imports, energy, technology. It cannot supply itself, while the West grows more dependent on the very demand it's feared, deploying tariffs, sanctions that fracture the supply chain, foregoing the rhythm of globalization and the once heralded specialization of economies and free trade. Now that I think of it, I will need to someday soon follow up this conversation and a few others and do a deep dive into a classic movie. I love movies. A deep dive into Rollerball, a 1980s flick, which, from my perspective, seems quite prophetic in its tale. Oh, by the way, it's not the Rollerball release in the early 2000s. It was I believe 1986 or 87, starring James Caan. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But not now. For a later date. Today, factories migrate to India, Vietnam, Mexico, following cheap labor, leaving trust behind. The world once moved in unison. Now it trembles, fragments, each economy orbiting its own anxiety. But capital, restless, still seeks the path of least resistance. It flows towards the brightest illusion and loudest dream. Now, the last time the Fed faced this circumstance was the 1960s. We were coming out of the Vietnam War, in the Vietnam War, a war which we had no prudence about, a war that proved Eisenhower's words of warning with respect to the military-industrial complex, more than prophetic, factual. But anyway, so we could not afford the war, essentially. But to pay for more planes and more weaponry and soldiers and all the things that come with the cost of war, Johnson demanded that the Fed chairman at that point in time, William Chesney Burns, I believe it was, as term in office has suffered in time. Well, he demanded that Chairman Burns print money to pay for the profligacy of the time. You see, one of the issues with debt is that when your liabilities are greater than your stock of money, your wealth, if you will, what you do is you print more money. It's called, at that point, fiat currency. And as I've mentioned before, and will mention, I'm sure, in times to come, the world is awash in fiat money. That's one of the parallels of the 60s to today. Because after Johnson demanded more money, remember it's guns or butter in primary 101 economics, can't have both. So after we went through the printing of all of this money, in response, Nixon, who did not want to be restrained by the limits of currency boundaries, took us off the gold standard. This freed up the printing press. No longer was the system bound, constrained by the limits of money. It could just print. And print it did. It led to many years of economic peril, hyperinflation, high interest rates. So high that I believe at one point, short-term notes, short-term yields were 20%. A little bit greater, actually. Imagine that. Well, today we can't imagine that. Today we think of only returning to the recent folly with negative rates and zero rates. It seems like a dream today. But once again, that's the path we'd like to be back on. Despite all the risk and instability it brings about, or it brings on, we are willing to risk it again to feed our greed in the moment. During this time, or in response, Chairman Volcker came on board to get control of the system, raise rates. Like I said, I think short rates were in the neighborhood of 20-ish plus percent. Longer term rates, I remember so this was 01 or so. I remember the 15 3/4 of 01. It was a 20-year note. I believe it did bottom the market, but wow, there was such a panic, such a fear, such an anxiety. Would we ever come out of a predictable breaking of the system? You see, and that's all those high interest rates and inflation. They threaten the survival of the economy. An economy simply cannot survive with such high rates. They must be gotten hold of. Expectations must be brought back to some manageable state. It's a slow breaking process, but it has to be done. Once again, someone has to pay the price. But every time in recent modern history, really since Greenspan, but every time we reach a breaking point like this, where the economy is threatened and our profits are threatened and our greed Our greed is at risk. What do? We keep falling back into the same trappings of printing more money, printing more money. We did it in 87, we did it in 2000, we did it in '08, we did it in the COVID period. We can't seem to get out of it. Well, perhaps, who knows? I don't. But we're back in that zone again, as I said, of great peril if we don't respond in some sort of prudent way, especially when there's so much at risk. And one of the additional systemic risks I would highlight now is in times before, we've had an international coalition come together to deal with a problem because they're all so much interconnected and intertwined and dependent upon one another that you need a sort of global coalition to come together. Everybody's got to be there. But I can't see in today's world how with our leadership we come together and unite with any coalition of the willing, it's more the today, that is, the desires of the authorities. I'll leave it at that. And this leaves us with a circumstance with respect to money where no currency has any value. The only value they have is the relative value that they have with trading with or against one another. The yen versus the dollar, or the pound versus the shekel, whatever it might be. There's relative value that exists for periods of time, but no currency can stand on its own. No absolute value. Outside the system, if the system should break, all will fall if we lose that relative relationship, because no one can stand on its own. And that's why today you see this gold frenzy, where gold has gone parabolic, much like, again, what happened in the 60s. This too is a warning sign. It's a sign that says, hey guys, gals, something's awry. Something's breaking. I'm fearing something. And so capital says, well, where do I go? I don't want to buy dollars. I already got too many of them. And you know what? I don't know that America is part of any global leadership anymore, or worthy of any sort of what's called world currency, dollarization of the world. Why should they stand in the lead? Well, where else can we go? What else can we buy? What can be our store of value and our medium of exchange? Well, for the longest period of time, it's been gold. And so the rush is on. Central bankers no longer buying any currency, especially dollars. So they're hoarding up, loading up on their gold reserves. It's the only thing that's withstood the test of time, the test of tragedy, the test or the need for something absolute, something strong, something hard. So they run to the gold market. Crypto too is, in theory, an alternative to the fiat currency world. But yet it's been untried, untested. I suspect that near term it's going to have its day. All in all, this is not a circumstance, not a time where where one should be confident of the future of investments, capital, of markets, of society in general. I say that with great humility and anxiety. For even societies will be at risk. It's alarming to say the least. And again, I can't emphasize enough. Central banks, not just Washington, Tokyo, across the globe, are on the same path. Doing the same sort of thing. Billions, trillions, trillions. Sovereign bonds, assets, conjured from air. Purchases with money printed in-house. Governments issue IOUs. Central banks buy them. With imaginary funds. Circular trade of promises. Each side pretending the other is solvent. The question isn't whether we'll crash. It's when. And when we do, finally remember what Newton knew. That every motion meets resistance. That every action invites its response. That no matter how high we soar, gravity always wins. Because the laws of motion never change. They're immutable. They never lie. Only the crowd does. So, in closing, let me say this. There are three types of people who I've seen and believe win in markets. There's a ignorant, dumb, but they make, or many I've seen, make millions. How much evidence there is of that today. That's one group. Another group is people who follow the crowd. People who are willing to join the herd, go mad in the herd, lose themselves. And then there are the greedy. The ones who will do anything. Lie, cheat, steal, create, narrate tales, spins, to fool the herd, and steer them into the gallows. Now, if you're one of those three, you have no need to be alarmed, concerned. Do what you do. And my words, I'm sure, will fall on faint ears, no matter how cautious or responsible or prudent they may be. But here's what I have to say to those people, persons. You ever seen a flock of geese flying south in the sky in perfect sort of formation? It's a beautiful sight, isn't it? But I want you to, for a moment, put yourself in the position of that last goose flying behind the others. You know what they get? They get a lot of shit in their face. Now, if you're human, if you choose to follow the crowd, I strongly suggest, advise with hope that at some point that you carry some Diddy oil. You'll need it. So I'll be updating at some interval. I'm not sure when. Speaking about markets is not going to be the aim of, not the singular aim, if you will, or even society of my platform. Boom, boom, V, V, V. V. V for vibration, vibe. V for vision. V for voice, which is what I come mostly to claim, which is what I come mostly to speak about, to share, to enlighten. I markets, political circumstances, society, those dimensions I will occasionally address, speak upon, but mostly I will be targeting or living, studying, understanding, articulating, communicating the other dimensions, the fifth and the sixth, which is where I prefer to rest today, live, thrive, and hope that you will come along. I certainly invite you. Until then, namaste. And before I leave, let me say, if nothing else from tonight's message, if nothing else from tonight's message, moment together, I leave you with this. Fly me to the moon. Let me play amongst the stars. And let me see what spring is like on Jupiter or Mars. In other words, hold my hand. In other words, baby, kiss me.